Thank you for watching. This is Now. We have a lot of news to get to live here from the H&N Digital Center. Let's start with some news out of Washington. That's where President Biden has just met with the Prime Minister of Japan, really talking about a wide range of issues.
Yeah, this comes as they look to strengthen their bond and their allies in a time of provocation by China and North Korean military action. I spoke with our Washington correspondent Josh Rottenberg a short time ago about this and other news out of Washington.
Yeah, good afternoon, Dylan. Look, this was a really important meeting. This was Prime Minister Kishida's first visit to the United States since he took office in October of 2021, and it's significant because Japan is our most important ally in the Asian region. And also, Japan is the president of the G7, and so with the G7 coming up, the summit coming up in May in Hiroshima, this was really a precursor to that. But President Biden and the Prime Minister spoke about a number of different things. First and foremost, obviously, they talked about the economic policies of the G7, but they also talked about some of their adversaries. Obviously, North Korea and with some of the weapons of mass destruction that they have and the ballistic missiles. They talked about Russia and the war in Ukraine, and obviously China with the potential aggression against Taiwan. And President Biden really commended Japan for its national security strategy and its increase in its defense level spending. But at the same time, these two leaders are getting together at a time where they're both dealing with political fallout. Obviously, President Biden dealing with this classified documents case, and then the Prime Minister is dealing with a number of government officials that have resigned in recent months, and also his approval rating is very low at the moment. So both are hoping to get something politically out of this as well.
Yeah, let's talk about the Biden classified document scandal. What is the latest on that?
Yeah, so Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, she briefed this afternoon, and she said that the White House is still fully cooperating with the Department of Justice and the special counsel, but she did not say whether or not President Biden would sit down for an interview with the special counsel. She also talked about how the White House has, quote unquote, spoken when it's appropriate as far as informing the American people about what's going on here, because remember, we only learned about this after news reports surfaced this week. Meanwhile, the White House, at the very earliest, has known about this going back to November on the record. She also talked about how the White House was not given a heads up as far as an announcement on a special counsel. And she also herself said that she was not a part of any communication strategy to try to suppress any information from the American people. We also learned a little bit more about the initial investigation prior to the announcement of the special counsel. We know that multiple aides to the then Vice President, now President Joe Biden, were interviewed, and we're also learning about a couple of investigations that are already turning up. You have House Oversight Committee Chair James Comer, who says that in the next 2 weeks he wants a number of communications going back between any potential violation of the Presidential Records Act, and then House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan wants to look into how the investigators are handling this, how the DOJ is handling this document situation versus Trump's document situation.
Thank you very much for that. And let's look now to the House of Representatives. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy is raising some eyebrows over former President Trump. What did he say?
Yeah, so yesterday at a press conference, he was asked about potential expungement of Trump's impeachments. And he said that he understood why a number of his colleagues would bring this to his attention and that he would, quote unquote, look at it. Now, in the last Congress, there were 30 or so House Republicans that brought out a resolution that said that they would expunge the impeachment from the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and Conference Chair Elise Stefanik supported it. But remember, when Kevin McCarthy was House Minority Leader, he said that President Trump bared responsibility for the attack on the Capitol. But nonetheless, that could move forward if reintroduced here. And then also in the last Congress, there was a small group of Republicans that brought forth the potential expungement for Trump's impeachment when it came to withholding aid from Ukraine and potentially pressuring them to announce an investigation against his political rival, Joe Biden.
H&N's Washington correspondent Josh Rottenberg, thank you so much for joining us here today on This Is Now.
You got it.